Welcome back to the deep dive. This is your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, where we take these complex, multi-layered sources, archaeological reports, geological surveys, forensic analyses, and we boil it all down.
We give you the facts and the insights you need to really get the big picture.
Exactly. We're skipping the textbook today and jumping straight into a story about, just immense time, incredible creatures, and one of the most frustrating scientific debates in North American history.
It really is.
Today, we are plunging into the Lamb Spring Archaeological Preserve. You'll see it in the records as 5DA2.
Right.
And this site is southwest of Denver, Colorado. It's kind of tucked away near Littleton and Chatfield State Park. And it is quite literally a stacked history book.
And what's so fascinating is that it's the only major Paleo-Indian site. We're talking deposits dating back well before 6000 BCE.
Yeah.
That's been found and preserved right there inside the modern Denver metro area.
It's this irreplaceable window into the deep past, just hiding in plain sight.
And the sources we've pulled together for you really reflect that complexity. We've got reports from the U.S. Geological Survey, deep geoarchaeological analyses, stuff that maps the very structure of the ground itself.
Right.
We also have accounts from major Smithsonian expeditions that span decades and some truly cutting-edge forensic results. We're going to get into how scientists use blood residue analysis on ancient tools.
Oh, that's the stuff that it provides these amazing, surprising insights into survival.
It really does.
So our mission today is to unpack why Lamb Spring isn't just a local footnote, but a critical benchmark in Paleo-Indian studies. We need to clearly define the two major stories the site tells.
And they are very different stories.
Very different. One is clear, definitive evidence of a later occupation. The other is this contentious, really ambiguous layer of evidence that puts Lamb Spring right at the heart of what they call the pre-Clovis conundrum.
That's the flashpoint.
Okay, let's unpack this. This site holds two major truths. One is clear, it's well dated, it's technologically specific. The other is a layer of potential human history that could be 13,000 years old. And it has caused archaeologists headaches for over 60 years because they can't prove it, not definitively.
And that's really the core of it. Like you said, its significance starts with its location, but it's also the largest known collection of Columbian mammoth bones. That's Mammoths columbi in all of Colorado.
Wow, how many are we talking about?
The remains of at least 23 individuals, maybe even more than 30. It's a massive collection. But beyond the paleontology, the real challenge is that it's a multi-component site.
Okay, what does that mean exactly, multi-component?
It just means this was a good spot, it was a reliable spring, so people and animals kept coming back for millennia. The geological layers record activity spanning thousands of years.
Well, you have layers on top of layers.
Exactly. It starts with those incredibly deep, problematic layers that might be 13,000 years old. Then you have established Clovis material, then the later Cody complex, the Archaic, the Woodland period.
All the way up to, what, historic times?
All the way up to historic American settlement. So the big scientific headache is just separating the natural stuff. Animals dying at a water hole, sediment washing in from definitive human activity in those deepest, oldest layers.
That's the perfect context. So let's start the story at the beginning with the discovery. And it's such a classic accidental find.
It almost always is.
Right. It's the kind of luck that researchers both celebrate and sort of dread because the act of discovery almost always messes up the context.
It does. The site was revealed in the summer of 1960. You have a local Littleton rancher, Charles Lamb.
Hence the name.
Hence the name. And he's just doing what ranchers do. He's improving his land, making sure his livestock has water. He's digging near a spring to create a better stock pond.
It's a normal day's work.
A completely normal day. And then he hits bone, and not just, small bones, he hits extensive Pleistocene mammal bones, and critically, these huge mammoth tusks.
Wow. And they knew right away they were old.
The estimate right away was around 13,000 years old, which immediately set this potential timeline that was, it was much older than the accepted consensus at the time.
So that must have brought the experts running.
Immediately. The initial scientific confirmation came from G. Edward Lewis of the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, based right there in Denver.
And what did he find?
He confirmed remains from mammoth, horse, camel, ancient bison, and antilocaprids, which is it's a fantastic cross-section of the late Pleistocene megafauna.
But that's paleontology. What made it an archaeology site?
That was the real catalyst. Lewis and a USGS geologist, Glenn Scott, they did some preliminary tests, and they recovered worked flint chips.
Stone flakes.
Stone flakes.
So finding those flakes in the same layer as the bones of extinct animals like mammoths,
Hmm.
that immediately brings up the big question.
Did humans kill them?
Precisely. That co-occurrence of stone artifacts with the remains of animals that went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. It just raised this huge red flag for a potential human association.
And once the USGS suggested that, I imagine it became a much bigger deal.
It warranted a full-scale, interdisciplinary investigation by the biggest name in the business, the Smithsonian Institution.
And that brings us to the two major phases of investigation. This history really shows how much archaeology itself has evolved. A phase that was almost immediate, right? 1961 to 62.
Yep. The Smithsonian deployed a massive team, led by Waldo Weddell for archaeology and C.L. Gazin for paleontology. It was a huge project, funded by the National Science Foundation.
And what was their goal? To prove the human connection.
That was the primary goal, but they ran into a wall. The stratigraphy, the layers of Earth were just too challenging. They confirmed it was a multi-component site, with bones and artifacts in different levels.
But they couldn't seal the deal on the oldest layer.
They couldn't. Their main objective, to find a firm, uncontestable association between the oldest artifacts and the earliest mammoth remains, was not met. They found hints, they found fragments, but in the world of early American archaeology, a hint is not proof.
And the sources point to a specific logistical problem from that first dig, something they did that later teams regretted.
They made a choice that was really pragmatic at the time, given their equipment and funding, but it turned out to be a critical flaw.
What was it?
Most of the big bones that were sticking out of the walls of their excavation trenches, huge ribs, massive leg bones, they left them in situ. They just covered them back up.
To preserve them.
To preserve them for future study, yeah.
Yeah.
But the consequence was that the area right next to the main bone pile, the critical spot where you'd expect to find the actual tools or cut marks,
That area wasn't fully excavated.
it wasn't fully excavated. So they left the biggest question unanswered because they didn't or couldn't expose the heart of the activity.
So they had the bones, they had potential tools, but they just couldn't definitively link them. And that inconclusive result is what led to phase 2 almost 20 years later.
That's right. Fieldwork started up again in 1980 and 1981. This time it was led by Dr. Dennis Stanford from the Smithsonian, working again with Glenn Scott from the USGS.
And this time, National Geographic was funding it.
Correct.
Now, Stanford's name immediately signals that this dig was going to be controversial. He was known for tackling sites that really pushed back against the Clovis first model.
Absolutely. Stanford was a prominent and very vocal figure. He was working on other really controversial pre-Clovis sites like Selby and Dutton. So the goal for phase 2 was explicit. Reopen the site with modern techniques and fix the problems of stratigraphy and context that the first team left behind.
They knew exactly what they were looking for.
They knew what was missing and where to look.
And did they find it?
They had success, yes, but mostly in the younger, shallower layers.
Wow.
The 1980s team successfully defined a distinct, securely dated Cody complex bone bed in the upper levels. So they confirmed, without a doubt, a later use of the spring for bison processing. That part of the mystery was solved.
But the deeper mystery.
The deeper mystery, confirming that earliest human presence, remained focused on that complex Pleistocene deposit. And the scientific community is still divided on whether the evidence really justifies a pre-Clovis claim. That debate is still going on.
And it's important to say the story doesn't just stop in the 80s. There's been a huge modern push for preservation.
Of a very deliberate shift toward long-term stewardship. In 1995, the Archaeological Conservancy acquired the 32 acres, and this was a major effort with support from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Douglas County, and the Smithsonian.
And that changed the whole philosophy, right?
It fundamentally shifted the management. The priority became preservation in situ, leaving those controversial deep layers undisturbed, rather than just digging everything up.
Which is a crucial strategy in modern archaeology. You save some for the future, for when the technology gets better.
Exactly.
And this also applies to the incredible fossils themselves, like that massive mammoth skull they pulled out years later.
Oh, it's a true star piece. It really shows you the scale of these animals. So, in 2002, they re-excavated a complete Columbian mammoth skull.
The one the Stanford team had reburied.
The very same one. They had originally exposed it, photographed it, and then carefully reburied it in '81 to protect it. So in 2002, they brought it up again, stabilized it, conserved it, and moved it to the Denver Museum for study.
It just highlights this ongoing effort, decades after the first discovery, to manage and protect these irreplaceable finds.
hmm To really get into the scientific challenge here, you have to read the ground first. At this depth, archaeology becomes geoarchaeology.
So the soil and the water are just as important as the stone tools.
In many ways, more important. This is where the site's reliability is either won or lost. It's about being able to tell the difference between something people did and something that just happened naturally over time.
Right. Distinguishing cultural activity from, say, just things washing around in a spring.
Precisely. So let's start at the very bottom. The base layer of the site is a geological unit called the Dawson Arkose.
Okay, what's that?
It's a deep formation of heavily weathered granite sands and small pebbles. It's the stable bedrock that everything else piled up on top of over thousands of years.
And the structure of this base layer, it provides a key piece of evidence, right? Even though it's kind of a negative finding. It tells us what couldn't have happened naturally there.
That's the elegant part. Geological analysis showed definitively that the Dawson Arkose formation at this specific spot did not contain any naturally occurring stones big enough or of the right type to make tools.
So no raw material.
The native rock was either too soft, too fractured, or just too small. You couldn't make a spear point or a knife out of it.
That is a brilliant constraint. So if the local rock is useless for tool making, and you find a sharp flake of imported chert or a piece of quartzite in the layers right above it,
Then you have really strong evidence for human presence. That geological fact means any of those high-quality stone artifacts recovered in the upper layers had to have been brought in by people.
carried in from miles away.
Right. It provides incredible support for defining those deposits as cultural, or at least human-influenced, rather than purely natural. The tool itself is proof of people. Its context is where the ambiguity starts.
And that's because once you move up from that stable base, things get messy. It's a spring, after all. Water is always mixing things up.
It gets very messy. You have this pervasive problem of mixing what we call turbation. The two uppermost units, where you find the later archaic, woodland, and historic stuff, were heavily disturbed.
By what? Farming? Animals?
All of the above. Rodents burrowing for centuries, plowing, modern activity. We call them zones of high turbation. Imagine 1,000 generations of gophers digging tunnels, plus ranching, plus freeze-thaw cycles bringing things to the surface.
So everything's jumbled.
Completely. In those top layers, they found historic artifacts, broken glass, rusty nails, barbed wire mixed right in with prehistoric stone flakes, woodland projectile points, archaic points. The stratification is just unreliable up there.
But the key layer, the one with the controversy, is the Mammoth level. And that sits directly on top of that sterile Dawson Arkose base.
This is where the action was. It formed in or right next to a late Pleistocene stream channel, which adds another layer of complexity.
And what makes this level so tricky to interpret?
It's the contradictory evidence we find in the bone preservation. On one hand, you have highly intact remains, like that complete mammoth skull and ribs. That suggests really rapid, pristine burial, maybe in a flood or just getting stuck in deep mud.
So a perfect snapshot in time.
You would think, but that's the contradiction. Mixed into that same layer are other bone fragments that show significant rounding on their edges, signs of prolonged weathering.
Meaning they were exposed for a long time or tumbled around in water.
Exactly. This mix suggests the mammoth level isn't a perfect snapshot. It's a complex, dynamic zone. It could be affected by hydraulic sorting water moving bones around, or older bones washing down from nearby slopes and settling into the channel.
And that geological messiness is the argument against a definitive pre-Clovis occupation.
It's the core of the argument. If the deposit is naturally mixed, that single imported artifact might have washed in later or moved down through the soil and has no real connection to the oldest bones.
This layered history, it paints such an incredible picture of the life that was once there. Lamb Spring is this perfect time capsule of the late Pleistocene environment.
The animal bones, the faunal inventory, are just essential for understanding the context. Beyond the mammoths, you have ancient bison, bison antiquus, ancient camels, ancient horses.
A true megafaunal paradise in Colorado.
It was. But this diversity leads right into the tragic story of the late Pleistocene extinction event. That moment the climate shifted and the continent's largest animals just disappeared.
And the site documents that shift.
It does. It happens after about 11,000 BCE. You see this warming, drying trend, a period that shows up in the stratigraphy as the altithermal age sea horizon.
Okay, can you define that for us, the altithermal horizon?
Sure. The altithermal is a specific paleoclimatic period in the Middle Holocene, marked by maximum warm and dry conditions. The sea horizon at Lamb Spring is the soil and sediment that formed during that severe arid phase.
And this climate change was devastating for the megafauna.
Ecologically devastating. The mammoths, camels, horses, they went extinct, primarily because their food sources, the grasslands, dried up. The one major survivor was the ancient bison. It was tough, it was adaptable.
And it became the primary food source for the later Paleo-Indian groups.
It became the crucial game animal for groups like the Cody complex.
Now, to solve the riddle of whether these bones just piled up naturally or if people were involved, we have to bring in the forensic science. Taphonomy.
Taphonomy is the single most important tool for differentiating a natural death site from a human butchery site.
So it's basically the study of everything that happens to an animal between when it dies and when an archaeologist finds it.
That's a perfect way to put it. When we study these bone beds, we're looking for specific, non-random evidence that proves human interaction. These are the telltale markers of intentional processing.
And what are those markers? What's the smoking gun?
They have to meet really stringent criteria. You're looking for clear-cut marks, microscopic parallel scratches left by a stone tool during skinning. You look for spiral or green bone fracturing, which means the bone was broken deliberately while it was fresh to get at the marrow.
Okay.
You also look for specific use wear on bone fragments that suggest they were used as tools themselves, and very importantly, pattern disarticulation.
Meaning the skeleton is taken apart in a specific, repeatable way.
Exactly. A way that suggests a learned human knowledge of anatomy, not just random scavenging.
So, applying those strict criteria to the mammoth level at Lamb Spring, the deepest, most controversial layer, what did they fail to find?
And this is where the pre-Clovis hypothesis really gets shaky. The earliest investigations noted how difficult it was to confirm definite human modification in that layer. They found suggestive evidence, sure,
Like what?
like the near absence of small bones like tail vertebrae or foot bones parts that hunters might carry away. That pattern is suggestive.
But suggestion isn't proof.
No. The barrier has always been the lack of widespread definitive markers. We don't see those unambiguous cut marks across multiple bones. We don't see consistent patterns of green bone fractures.
So you find scratches, but you can't be sure they're from tools.
Exactly. They found lots of scratches and marks on the bones, but crucially, they also found some of those same marks on tusk fragments and on highly weathered bone edges. That indicates that non-cultural causes, like dozens of other mammoths trampling the bones or geological pressure from shifting sediment, could easily account for those marks.
So if you have that level of ambiguity, you can't make the call.
You can't. The default scientific assumption has to be natural death unless you find robust, undeniable physical evidence of human processing in a pristine, undisturbed context. The burden of proof is just incredibly high.
And that failure to meet the burden of proof brings us right to the heart of the academic flashpoint, the pre-Clovis conundrum. For decades, the Clovis first model was the accepted timeline for humans in the Americas.
Dated roughly 11,050 to 10,750 BCE.
Right, and Lamb Spring, with its potential older dates, could have completely upended that.
The potential for a pre-Clovis occupation human presence before Clovis culture is really anchored by one specific piece of data. The oldest radiocarbon date from the Mammoth level.
Which was?
13,140 PM, $1,000 BP. Before present, that central value is older than Clovis, which is why researchers like Dennis Stanford, who championed alternatives to Clovis first, were so interested.
But that number, 13,140, only tells half the story. The date came with a huge statistical caveat, right?
It's more than a caveat. It basically makes the date unreliable for this kind of detailed chronological work. That date has an error margin of plus or minus a full millennium.
1,000 years.
1,000 years. Think about what that means. The true date could be as old as 14,140 BP, which would be dramatically pre-Clovis. Or it could be as young as 12,140 BP, which is firmly inside the Clovis timeline.
So the margin of error is so huge, it covers the entire period of debate.
Exactly. It makes it statistically useless for proving a precise cultural chronology for something this controversial.
And how does that fuzzy date compare to later dating attempts?
Well, a later, more refined date was run on better preserved bone from that same mammoth channel, and that one yielded 11,735 PM, 955 BP.
Much tighter.
Much, much tighter, an error margin of less than a century. And that date places the material firmly within the early Paleo-Indian or Clovis transition time frame. So the younger, more reliable date really undercuts the older, less precise one.
So if the dating is shaky, what physical evidence do proponents of the pre-Clovis idea cling to?
The physical anchor is one single artifact, the recovery of a small, culturally modified quartzite artifact found within the Mammoth level.
The one we talked about before that couldn't have come from the local geology.
The very same. Proponents argue that this single imported tool is definitive physical evidence of human activity associated with the extinct megafauna. It's proof people were there, even if we can't prove they were hunting mammoths.
Okay, but let's be critical here. Given the high standard of evidence needed, let's lay out the arguments for why Lamb Spring has not earned definitive pre-Clovis status. What are the three big scientific strikes against it?
Okay, strike one is the lack of a robust assemblage. We just don't have an array of multiple unquestionable artifacts in that layer. If this were a real kill site, you'd expect a whole toolkit, or at least a lot of fragments and flakes left behind from butchering, not just one piece.
One tool does not a toolkit make.
Precisely. Strike two is the taphonomic confounding, which goes back to the messy spring environment. The water action could have moved that single artifact. It could have washed in, settled down into an existing bone layer. Its association with the bones might be completely coincidental.
Okay. And strike three.
Strike three is the overall geoarchaeological viewpoint. The fact that the Mammoth level contains both pristine, rapidly buried bones and old, weathered, tumbled bones is irrefutable evidence that natural mixing was happening.
And if natural mixing is confirmed,
Then a scientist has to treat any association between an artifact and a bone as potentially coincidental, unless you have undeniable proof, like those cut marks we talked about.
so Lamb Spring remains this vital but ultimately unresolved piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. It's a key site for researchers exploring these questions. But the existing evidence just places it right in the middle of the academic controversy. It needs a future, high-resolution discovery to settle the debate.
And now we can transition from that fascinating but frustrating debate of maybe to the clear, undisputed history of the site. The later occupation by the Cody complex. It must be a relief to move from ambiguity to certainty.
The chronological clarity is incredibly satisfying, yes.
Oh.
The Cody complex occupation is securely dated to between roughly 9,000 and 8,400 years ago in the early Holocene.
And this coincides with that warm, dry, altithermal age.
Perfectly. And that environmental shift meant the whole focus of human subsistence had moved away from the extinct megafauna and toward the survivor, ancient bison.
Now, the Cody complex isn't just a random name. It's a known technological tradition, right? They were sophisticated tool makers.
They were renowned specialists. The tradition is identified by very specific types of projectile points, like the famous Eden and Scottsbluff points, and maybe most distinctly a specialized tool called the Cody knife.
And the excavations in the 80s found a clear Cody bison bone bed at Lamb Spring.
They did, about 30 to 60 centimeters below the current surface, and it was clearly a bison processing area associated with stone flakes and other tools.
What did that toolkit look like? What's the Cody signature at Lamb Spring?
The assemblage is impressive. They recovered a projectile point, some biface fragments, and, crucially, a fragmentary Cody knife. This specific knife, which is a wide, heavy butchery blade, was made from a dark green chert.
And that shirt wasn't local.
Not at all. It might have come from volcanic material in Wyoming or Montana, which tells you right away these people had long-distance networks or traveled vast territories to get the best tool stone.
And they found more than just the killing and butchering tools, right?
Yes, they found the maintenance tools, too. A sandstone shaft, a braider, a grooved stone used for smoothing spear or dart shafts, and a pumicide abrader, which you'd use for preparing animal hides for clothing or shelter. It confirms their identity as skilled, self-sufficient Paleo-Indian hunters.
But the real scientific breakthrough, the thing that elevated this site, came 2 decades later in the year 2000 from forensic analysis of those very tools.
This is one of the most exciting takeaways, and it completely changes our view of Paleo-Indian adaptability. In 2000, researchers conducted what's called blood residue analysis on 8 tools from that Cody layer.
And this isn't just looking for stains. It's a high-tech forensic method.
It's a high-resolution technique that identifies species-specific blood proteins left on the stone. It tells you exactly what that tool was used to process.
How does that even work? How can a 9,000-year-old tool still have identifiable blood on it?
It's like a forensic lock and key test. When an animal is butchered, tiny amounts of blood proteins get absorbed into microscopic cracks in the stone, and they can survive for millennia. The technique uses anti-serum, which is basically an antibody created to react only to the protein of a specific animal, like bison or rabbit.
So you test the tool against different anti-serums.
Exactly. You put a sample from the tool in a gel with the anti-serum and apply an electric current. If the tool has proteins from that animal, they move toward the antiserum and form visible line. It's a direct immunological confirmation.
And the result from that special green shirt Cody knife, the one designed for big game, was a total surprise.
It was revolutionary. The stem of that particular Cody knife gave a positive immunological reaction to rabbit antiserum.
Rabbit, not bison, the animal everyone associates with the Cody complex, but a rabbit.
This is the aha moment.
Oh.
While the Cody people were absolutely specialized bison hunters, we know they were doing that at Lamb Spring. This finding proves they were also practicing a highly diversified hunting strategy.
Out of necessity, you have to assume.
You have to. Think about the environment. The harsh, dry, altithermal. Large game would have been less predictable. A successful bison hunt might be followed by weeks of nothing.
So a big butchery tool is being used on a small animal.
Right. It suggests planned, flexible behavior. Rabbits are small, but they reproduce quickly and are always around. They're a buffer species.
So this moves our image of Paleo-Indians away from just being the bison hunter to something much more adaptable?
Exactly. They were managing risk through diversification. This flexibility, supplementing large game with small, stable resources, might be the real key to their resilience in a rapidly changing world.
And the story of Lamb Spring today is really about preservation. It's about locking away that central mystery for a future time when science is better.
It's a strong model for conservation archaeology. The Lamb Spring Archaeological Preserve was formed in 1995, and it has multiple layers of legal protection. It's on the Colorado State Register of Historic Properties and the U.S. National Register of Historic Places.
And it's a big collaboration, not just one institution.
It's a concerted effort. The Archaeological Conservancy was key, but they work with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Douglas County, and the Smithsonian. It's an acknowledgement that we can't solve the mysteries of the 1960s with the technology of the 1980s. We have to wait.
And they do connect the public to this history.
They do. They offer free public tours from May to October, and they have a long-term goal of building a museum. They see the Mammoth site in Hot Springs, South Dakota, as a kind of sister site for research and education.
So since they've left those ambiguous layers in the ground, how is new technology poised to finally solve the pre-Clovis question without just digging the whole place up?
Future work has to be almost entirely non-invasive. The first big tool is non-invasive subsurface survey. We're talking about using high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, or GPR.
GPR. So it's like an X-ray for the soil.
That's a great analogy. It sends radio waves into the ground and measures the reflections. Different materials, bone, sediment, rock, reflect the waves differently. So you can map the ancient stream channel, you can find dense pockets of stone or artifacts, all before you even stick a shovel in the ground.
So you can target your excavation with surgical precision.
Exactly. And the second directive is refining the chronology. We need refined dating using AMOS accelerator mass spectrometry.
How is AMS better than the old radiocarbon methods?
It's the sample size. The old methods needed a lot of material, which meant more risk of contamination and those big error margins. AMS can get an incredibly precise date from a tiny sample, just a few milligrams.
You could date the residue on a single tool.
Potentially. It's essential for nailing down the exact chronology and settling once and for all whether that quartzite artifact is 13,000 years old or 12,000 years old.
And the third area is even more futuristic, environmental DNA.
Or eDNA. Is transforming the field.
Wow.
All organisms shed DNA, and it can survive in the sediment for thousands of years. By analyzing soil samples, we can reconstruct the entire ancient environment, the plants, the other animals, without disturbing anything.
And finally, going back to the core problem, the lack of definitive proof on the bones themselves.
Right. The fourth key directive is a complete taphonomic reassessment of the bones that are already in museum collections.
So re-examining the old evidence with new eyes.
With new technology.
Oh.
Using high-power microscopy to search for microscopic cut marks or use wear that was missed the first time around, we can pull new secrets from the old material.
That's a powerful and responsible way to do science. Preserve the site, but reanalyze the artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
So we've covered a remarkable span of time today. Let's summarize the key takeaways for you. The story of Lamb Spring is really a study in two eras. We've seen it shift from this controversial, maybe pre-Clovis megafauna site defined by that frustratingly fuzzy date and a single tool to a clearly defined Cody complex bison processing site.
And that geoforensics insight is just paramount. Lamb Spring shows how geology is as important as the artifacts. The Baron Dawson Arcos proves people brought the tools in. But the messy spring channel complicates the interpretation of everything found there. The geology both created the mystery and prevents us from easily solving it.
So what does this all mean for the ongoing story of the first Americans? It means the narrative isn't settled, not at all. And sites like Lambsbrim are being conserved not just to remember the past, but because they hold the potential to rewrite the textbook in the future, if we can just bring the right tech to bear on the evidence.
And that leads to a final, provocative thought,
Yeah.
which is rooted in that one forensic discovery about the rabbit.
Right.
The finding that these specialized Cody hunters were supplementing their massive bison kills with small game. It raises a really important question. How many other specialized Paleo-Indian cultures were actually practicing a highly flexible mixed strategy that we just haven't detected because we've only been focused on the giant bone piles? This quiet adaptability, not just the spectacular mammoth hunts, might be the true key to understanding the resilience of the earliest people navigating a dying Ice Age world.